Thank you for having me, Honorable Chair Senator Edwards and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Dan Golden, and I'm honored to speak on behalf of SB 965. Great, we have a PowerPoint. Terrific. I'm going to review some of my prepared statements quickly because I know that I want to be sensitive to people speaking after me, and the I know you have to be on the floor at 4:30, but please, if I'm speaking too quickly, just jump in and interrupt. I work professionally as an engineer and an economist in the energy efficiency industry, and in my free time, I serve as policy director for Oregon Climate. We are a statewide network comprising more than 1,800 members, unified in our conviction that Oregon can build the model for fair and effective climate policy. SB 965 is the model. So I opened many of my presentations with this chart, and I won't dwell on it for long because I spoke about it already during the House Energy and Environment hearing on April 14th. But it tells a powerful story about our global relationship with fossil fuels, and I want especially to highlight 2 points. First, by any reasonable measure, we're losing. Right, that red line represents fossil fuel consumption, and it's going up at an alarming rate in an unrestrained way. Global consumption of renewable energy is growing at a historic rate, but global consumption of fossil fuels is growing 9 times faster. And you can see the reference to renewable energy is the green line down at the bottom. Now, we've all heard disingenuous pundits on the East Coast argue that heavy snow or a cold winter is somehow proof that climate change must be a hoax. And I might just as well claim that world hunger is over because I just ate lunch. But when I look at this data, I sometimes worry that we're all guilty of the same fallacy. Our Facebook feed suggests that solar roadways and Tesla's new toy for rich people are poised to replace fossil fuels, but that only makes sense if we selectively report on 1 year and 1 sector and 1 region with 1 fuel type. Our global energy economy is no more localized than the global climate, and we all consume iPhones and flat screens burning American coal in China, and we all share 1 atmosphere. So while renewable technologies are more promising than ever, they're not really a plan to get off of fossil fuels. Simply put, there's no relationship between renewable energy consumption and fossil fuel independence. But the data also tells us what does work, and that's increasing the price of fossil fuels. Consumption of fossil fuels only actually dropped 3 times in history: the 1973 oil crisis, the 1979 energy crisis, and the Great Recession. All of them have the same thing in common: a reduction in the purchasing power of fossil fuels. Both HB 3470 and SB 965 would accomplish this goal because capping emissions will drive up the price on fossil fuels. Any cap and trade policy, including SB 965, must start with the auction of carbon allowances. But what happens with the proceeds? And that's one of the key differences between these 2 bills. The intuitive thing would be to reinvest in renewable energy, but these data invite me to revisit that intuition. SB 965, as my esteemed colleague here pointed out, would require that all the revenue be evenly distributed to all Oregonians in the form of an annual dividend. And it's not just for one reason. First of all, the scientifically meaningful reductions prescribed in SB 965 and HB 3470 would be very difficult for low-income families who spend a relatively high fraction of their income on energy. The best science suggests that these reductions would bring gasoline prices to $12 per gallon by the end of the century. The 100% dividend guarantees that any person consuming less than the average amount of carbon would get more money back than they would spend each year. This means a progressive policy and not a regressive one. Secondly, since the data are telling us to stick with the carbon price, the dividend gives us our own internal insurance policy, something like the Alaska Permanent Fund. Every year, the state of Alaska collects a lease from the oil companies drilling on the North Slope, and then they distribute the money evenly to all Alaskans. Big Oil regularly tries to take down the Alaska Permanent Fund, but they can't. Alaskans just love getting that dividend check too much. So, as my esteemed colleague pointed out, the polling shows that the dividend isn't as popular as reinvestment. I would evoke the great Henry Ford, who once said, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, right? This is a 100-year plan. It's not what we're doing today. So we have to be ready for the titans of fossil fuels to attack our carbon price, and just as they did in Australia and succeeded, and we know exactly how to stop them, even after you've all left office, and that's a 100% dividend. Now, finally, and most importantly, we must think clearly about this revenue before anyone becomes dependent on it. Now, this chart projects the revenue Oregon would raise with a law like SB 965 or HB 3450. Now, for a number of reasons, you really can't avoid raising this revenue because these permits will have value and they will create scarcity as you move down the supply curve and up the demand curve. These data are derived from a model that REMI built, similar to the NERC study that you may all be familiar with. And it shows how revenue would change over time. Now, at first, allowance auctions would raise little or no money. We'd be issuing so many allowances that they wouldn't be very viable. But as they become scarcer, as an SB 965 prescribes an 85% reduction below 1990 levels by 2050, they'll start to gain value until 2030 when the revenue peaks out at $5 billion per year. At that point, the value of permits would continue to rise, but it would be offset by the decreased volume of permits. We must ultimately allow for zero carbon dioxide emissions, so it has to go all the way down to the bottom. And at that point, it doesn't matter how much a permit is worth, because if we auction none of them, we get no revenue. So the reason I bring this up, and the reason I say it's the most important point, and the reason why we strongly believe that the dividend is worth prescribing right now, is that we've seen this movie before. We've become dependent on tobacco revenues in order to sponsor our healthcare. We've become dependent on timber revenues to sponsor schools. We've become dependent on, lottery revenues, which is essentially a tax on low-income Oregonians. And once we're hooked to that, we can't get rid of it. And ultimately, how is that different from really the story of why climate change is happening in the first place? It's not that the fossil fuel companies have so much money. They don't, right? When you compare the amount of money that the fossil fuel industry has compared with the amount of money we all stand to lose for not doing anything with climate change, it's not that much. It's that all the value that we stand to lose is much more dispersed, and theirs is more concentrated. And this is, you can look at this story. You show me a problem in democracy, and I'll show you a place where concentrated stakeholdership is being leveraged to perpetuate the status quo. Now, when we raise this price, and it raises energy prices on consumers, if we don't redistribute that as a dividend, we'll be concentrating that oil money further, not less. And when we distribute it as a dividend, we disperse it. We create universal stakeholdership so that lots and lots of people have this revenue. So you can see at the peak, yeah, that dividend is going to get smaller too. And yes, Oregonians are going to dislike it. And yes, it's going to be hard to get over that peak when that dividend starts to get smaller. But at least at that point, we won't have our entire state or some industry dependent on it. At least at that point, the concentration of stakeholdership won't be concentrated anymore. It'll be dispersed, and it'll be harder to be able to get rid of it. Now, you can see there are a number of examples of fossil fuel of taxes on fossil fuels, of carbon taxes in other states and countries. And you can see that, looking at where they fit within the framework of this REMI data, none of them have even Sweden and Switzerland, which is up to $135 per ton, none of them are even close to this peak. And I think the reasonable expectation is that as they raise more revenue and as they get more revenue from fossil fuels and that stakeholdership in their government becomes more concentrated on them, they're never going to be able to get past that top of the curve. They can't get to zero. We regard, and this is the reason why all the biggest names nationally support this proposition. Why the James Hansons, the Bill McKibbins, the Robert Reich, and Hank Paulson and George Shultz. All these names, they say it's got to be a dividend because it's the only way to protect low-income families, protect the policy for a while, and then keep it hard, actually make it feasible that you could get down to zero without building new dependencies on it. And more to the point, aren't we really here to build a model? I mean, the opposition panel clearly pointed out Oregon doesn't have that big of a contribution to global climate change. If we have a contribution, it's the same thing that, California gave in terms of, the Clean Air Act and what Massachusetts gave in terms of the Affordable Care Act. All of our major legislation follows the state. We need a state to be able to prove this model. But what will we be proving if all we've done is taken the money away from the fossil fuel companies and instead become dependent on it inside our state? What really will it show when we say that's blood money, it's poisonous, you can't spend it, and instead, we'd like to spend it now? We think that really proving the model of effective climate legislation means committing to that bipartisanship. From the very time that you even start talking about it in an informational hearing, we're making the commitment. This is not designed to raise revenue. This is not designed to support bigger government. This is designed to control fossil fuels, to disperse the stakeholdership, and really create a predictable transition for the next era of energy consumption. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Brzezinski.
Dan, sitting and listening, I'm almost thinking you're making an argument that, to me, is going to take us down the same road we've gone with the kicker. It's kind of like, unfortunately, we've had the Republicans in their time in 1999 actually put into the Constitution. Now we can't ever have that conversation. So now we know this money that's there that could be reinvested in multiple ways, and on the general fund perspective is no longer there unless we hit some soft spot. And it seems to me, why wouldn't we, if we're really wanting to make these type of changes in our energy consumption and impact the environment that we have and pass on for future generations, what's wrong with having that money that would be coming out from the proposal of 3470 and having it reinvested to continue this growth and cycle. It seems to me we would be benefiting generations further down the road as compared to having people say, that's mine, I want it. And I understand that they're going to potentially spin it back into the communities and in our state, but have we been short-sighted, as I feel we were, as to how the kicker is now not able to actually use money where in this day and time today, we're looking at trying to shore up these various budgets that would have more impact on families and kids.
Honorable Chair, Senator Brzezinski, thank you for the question. And I totally, absolutely share your initial impression about the kicker. And I think, I think it's worth noting that it really is philosophically an entirely different idea. The kicker, it's killing us because we have noise in the way that our revenue performs. And when times are good, we can't do anything about it. When times are bad, we're kind of SOL. I think that this is something really different, right? This is, we're building a model here. The idea is to build a model. It's not about our 0.5% of contribution of greenhouse gas emissions, right? It's about our ability to actually prove climate change is not an elaborate hoax to grow the government or to finance some kind of a new program, And I think that if we wanted to go a reinvestment route, and if that were a model that were going to work, it already would be working in California. It hasn't really changed the debate. You still hear the same talking points nationally. It's that everyone suspects this is going to be, a way to, to grow our government. And what I would suggest is start with a price signal. See what happens inside investment markets, because they're going to change. If once you have this level of predictability that only you can get from something like the Alaska Permanent Fund, investors will change their behavior. And once that happens, if we need to look at maybe there should be some way that we can finance this with government action, that would be great. But we shouldn't do it with a regressive tax. And that's what a carbon tax would be without a dividend. The dividend is the only way to make it progressive instead of regressive. Is that?
One follow-up.
Yeah, follow-up.
I guess growing government, to me, I don't see this as a process to grow government. What I see is a means to actually set a model, get a reduction in the carbon impact that we're having, and then taking the money that comes from that and continuing down the road of taking the change on the environment as to what we consider are going to be and already showing to be detrimental in climate change, et cetera. So I don't buy that the analysis that somehow this is growing government as much as taking care and having a direct impact on the environment as to the negatives that are now impacting us to the level that they are. Thank you.
All right. Question?
Yes,
yeah.
thanks. In terms of the plan for how the dividends would be distributed, they would go out to Oregon households in a progressive manner, or sort of just in a equal shares, or more going to people who are negatively affected by the cost of energy. How is that being projected?
Honorable Chair and Senator Demborough, thank you for the question, and it's a very good question. Right now it's prescribed, just even dividend goes back to everybody. The idea there, though, is that while low-income families spend a higher fraction of their income on energy, in an absolute sense, they spend less. So the best research, the best forecasts show that 2/3 of low-income Americans, the 2/3 of Oregonians in the lowest end of the income spectrum would actually get more money back in revenue than they would spend in their dividend. Now, we could try to skew that to be even more progressive. To me, I feel like this is already arguably will be one of the more progressive income distribution schemes, in recent history. But I would say that there's a big benefit to making it simple, to not turning this into an agency that has to allocate who gets the money, to not turning it into another covered Oregon. SB 965 has a mechanism that already exists. It uses essentially the Department of Revenue to distribute checks in a simple, non-mathematical way to anybody that filed a tax return in Oregon and that has a dependent. So we believe that the simplicity and transparency of that outweighs the potential benefits that we could get from an increase subtly in how progressive it already is. But that, hey, let's make an amendment,
Yeah. Well, just to follow up, I think we do. Obviously, as you say, low-income people are paying more in energy costs than others, and some of that is due to the fact that they're living in homes that are, not as weatherproof. They're driving cars that are not as fuel efficient. They don't have the resources currently to invest in those upgrades that will save them money. And it really does seem to me that whatever program we land on needs to take that into account and make sure that they're being helped so that, that they have the assistance in a way that it doesn't become an ongoing negative burden on them with respect to others.
Well, Senator Denborough, I believe that being poor in America means knowing exactly what everything costs, and nobody knows how to make a budget like somebody who's struggling month to month like that. If you're losing $400 a month in heating because you're under insulated, I think empirically, and I can tell you this because I work in energy efficiency. If these folks get that lump sum, and the best science estimates it would rise somewhere by 2020 to about $500 to $1,500 a year. If they get that sum, the reasonable expectation is they're going to spend it to make those savings, and they'll be in a better position to do it. And I believe in the capacity of low-income Americans to be able to make those choices wisely.